Welcome back, and we're moving into our first conversation for today, discussing the Political Reform Commission recommendations of 2000. Now, it seems like a very long time ago, but interestingly, once we get the conversation started, so many of these issues are still very relevant today. And we have with us this morning a former commissioner from this particular group, Carolyn Sanford. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Marlene. Good morning, Zanny, and thanks for having me here again. And of course, Happy New Year to Belize.
Thank you. Now, we know we made you have to dig up into your archives to be able to find the recommendations and some of the work that went into develop them. Let's take a step back and talk about the establishment of the Political Reform Commission back at that time, and what were some of the reasons why it was recommended that they got together and made these recommendations.
Certainly, and it's good that you said start from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think the issue of political reform is not a one-time event or a one-time activity. It is really a process, and it is continuous. Because political reform is supposed to be alive. It is supposed to be changing the way we do things based on the expectations of our people. So political reform has always been somewhere out there, discussions perhaps in various organizations and so on and so forth. And you may recall in 1994, I think it was at SPARE, was one of the organizations that led the first sort of organized political reform process. During the period leading up to the 1998 elections, one of the great platforms of the then People's United Party manifesto was for political reform, because there were many issues that were being discussed then, issues, for example, of corruption, issues of poverty, issues of crime and violence, issues of women not participating in the decision-making process, issues that had to do with the relationship between the cabinet, the legislature, the executive, the legislation, the judiciary, what one would call there's no separation, so to speak, of powers in the eyes of the people, the issue of the monarchy, do we maintain the monarchy? And so there were many issues that were in the discussions, and which led to then the formation of the Political Reform Commission, by the then Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Said Musa. It had a representation from many entities, from the bar, from civil society, which was the bar, from the unions, from chamber, from indigenous organizations, from government. So it was well represented in terms of what I would call the main organizations and institutions. And so it had a mandate then to go out and have a conversation with the Belizean people as to what it is that we want to see. What are these changes that we want to see? But I want to highlight two key points as a part of the mandate. There were 7 key things on the mandate. Most of it was sort of administrative, the public service providing the logistical support, putting together a national campaign, and so on and so forth. But I think the 2 key ones that I would want to focus on today is the first that says, review the system of governance. And if you notice, it said governance, not government. Governance. And to make recommendations for its improvement, whether by amendments to the Constitution, or, it didn't say and, it said or, laws or otherwise, with a view to achieving greater democracy. So that was perhaps the platform or the signature mandate of the Commission. Another one which is very important, it says complete its work in 1 year. So there was a timeline that was set, and there was this broad mandate as to what was supposed to have happened. Having said that, of course, the Commission went about its business, and of course it did its consultation. It had several town meetings. It had correspondence from the public in general, so it was on the media and so on and so forth. And out of that, there was 153 recommendations. 49% have been implemented. I think that was what has been implemented. I think we had about 31%, which was partially implemented, and the rest was not implemented. And so that is where we were at this, what I would say at this point in time, based on some of the conversations I've had.
Yeah.
In terms of everything that has been either researched, in terms of what has been learned, and in terms of what has been implemented since this particular exercise, are we still in line with what some of these recommendations are? Have we veered so far away from what we ought to have been putting in place and practicing in terms of governance, for instance?
I think if I can go back to what the mandate was, and as I've said, it's very broad, and as I mentioned, the issue of governance, the issue of amendments to Constitution and laws, and the issue of greater democracy. I think one needs to start looking at exactly what we meant by that. First of all, governance is not government, and oftentimes we use them interchangeably. Government is that entity that is elected by the people to represent the people. Governance includes government and all stakeholders who are part of a process that is delivering a particular service to the nation of Belize. So when the Political Reform Commission started, for example, at that point in time, I would say we were transitioning from a kind of state-led, state total engagement in delivering a service to where we are now, where we have both state and we have civil society. But then we must go back to understand and appreciate that the development of Belize was such that the government, to a large extent, controlled, managed, led everything. It was seen that the solution to everything then was the government. Go to the government. The government is supposed to do this, the government is supposed to do that. Now we have civil society who are also participating in the process. So if we look at then what is government when we enter the political reform process and what is governance, governance is a much broader concept than just government. So that is one aspect that one wants to look at. Now, if we also look at the process itself, if I can highlight three key things about the process which may lead to why your answer. Let us look at which says amendments to the Constitution or laws. Political reform is more than constitutional reform. Constitutional reform, which is truly what we actually did, because what we did was went through a process of going through the Constitution of Belize, section by section, which is very important and which is very fundamental, because the Constitution itself sets out how we are to be governed by the state or the government. And as I think many people have sat on this couch and explained the Constitution, which I won't go there. But the Constitution, then, like I said, is overarching. But the Constitution is also supported by legislation, other legislation. And so the political reform process then, to my mind, was a bit narrow in that it focused a lot on the Constitution, but did not focus in general on the Constitution plus laws plus many other components which would have led to this reform process. It doesn't mean that it did not address some other, because issues like structured education process and so is the other. But if I can refer, and perhaps a classic example of where we are, use this as an example. There were 14 pitfalls, so to speak, that were identified in this process. One pitfall had to do that the system does not provide enough support for the poor. In other words, the poor are not benefiting from the system. Now, if we look at our Constitution, which there are certain parts which were kept, and there were other recommendations for change, things like right to basic education and so on and so forth. Excellent. But there is a section that said policies of state should, if I recall, policies of state should eliminate social and economic privilege and disparity. Yes? So if you look at the Constitution, there is nothing in the Constitution that speaks to how we are going to eliminate social and economic privilege and disparity. Now, the constitutional reform, one of the pitfalls, it said, was the issue of poverty. So the reform process did not address that at all, in my mind. How do you address that? It said policies of state. And if you notice, it said constitution or laws. Now, if we look at the Constitution, that gave effect to eliminating economic and social disparity, which would then lead to the eradication of poverty, so to speak. But then we then have to start looking at the legislation. Two quick examples. If I look at the Education Act, for example, it speaks to a child must be in school until 14 or something to that effect. Now, if you don't go beyond 14, what kind of remuneration can you achieve from a primary school education? There is sufficient studies that shows there's a correlation between your levels of educational attainment, and let me be clear that educational attainment doesn't necessarily mean academic attainment. It could be vocational attainment, technical attainment, and so on and so forth. So there are correlations between that. But if our law is saying that it's only up to 14, you belong in school, then how can we eliminate economic privilege and disparity? You see? So that just goes to show you that. So here you have...
It seems contradictory in a sense.
Exactly. And so that is the point I'm making in the saying that, yes, there were 14 pitfalls. And the process proceeded for the year. And then there were 153 recommendations that came out. And several of those recommendations, and if you would review them, and anyone wishing to get a copy of them, I have them available in terms of what has been approved and what has been implemented, partially implemented, or not implemented. You're going to see that certain of the implementations, for example, referred to, we will keep as is. So there are certain sections of the law that we kept. So it was implemented. And then there were some that, well, we say partially implemented because it would have set out one recommendation, the 103, would have set out sub-recommendations. And I think we had something like 23 of those that had some 92 sub-recommendations. And if I recall, out of that, I think it was like 38% or something was actually implemented. Now, so going back to where we are. So here you then have policies of state will eliminate, but in the Education Act. Another example, land. Land is the wealth of our nation. If you all can have a conversation with many people, the key outside of education, the key contribute to removing you from poverty, to taking you out of that trap of poverty is land. And land ownership, because as we have known, the fishermen need a piece of land for put up their camp. You need a land for build your house. If you're to conduct a business, you need a land. Where are the policies of state which basically state that if you have a piece of land already, or you may have had your farmland, because sometimes it's not just a house land. People might do farming, so it's a house land plus your farmland, or your house land plus your land for your fishing camp or whatever. Once you have reached that, people who are applying, where are the policies that says you ought not to have had a piece of land before? Or if you're now getting a piece, it has to be tied into some economic activity, which will allow you to remove yourself from that poverty trap. Or if you have sufficient land, you will not get another piece. Or if you have land and flipped it 5 times, you get where I'm going with this. So the point then is that here you have the Constitution, and this is the point I want to finalize on. Here you have the Constitution, which we went through, but then we did not do the second step, which would have had to do with ensuring that the laws, and sometimes it's not just about laws, it's also about policies, because you have things like, we spoke earlier about the whole issue of education. One of the main recommendations that was not implemented had to do with a structured education campaign that engages the citizenry, that engages the school as to what is democracy, how is it that we are governed, how does these things impact and correlate with your way of life. So that is just one example of why I would say we went through that political reform is more than constitutional reform.
Yeah.
Political reform is really about removing those things that are unsatisfactory, abuses in the system, those things which the Belizean public is saying that we are not going to accept, or we see these as hindrance to our development.
From the everyman's perspective, the average Belizean who would have looked at this process, and it's quite a robust one, I take it to be. When you look at what all has been set out, what we aim to achieve, but then you look at the fact that while governance is separate from government, government, I would want to think, is the vehicle that would implement the policies and all these other elements, so to speak.
You're quite right.
But the individual has a sense of cynicism when they look at, well, while this stands to be as a neutral and objective measure to put in place, if it's red or blue and they come in with their own way of managing and implementing and carrying out or executing, then that's where the problem lies. Because while we have the document that says this is what ought to be done, everybody comes in with their own perspective on how things should be done, and they would more likely than not want things done their way.
Interesting, and this is where we speak of democracy. Because oftentimes I've heard people say, political parties are a problem, they're all corrupt, etc., etc. And just as you have said, all the cynicism and the disillusionment and the frustration coming. But if we really think of democracy, outside of speaking of efficiency and effectiveness and accountability and transparency, democracy also speaks to strong political parties. And strong political parties are anchored around an ideology. Whether that ideology is socialist, capitalist, free enterprise, mixed economy, whatever, it is centered around an ideology. Oftentimes, the electorate gets caught up in the personalities of politics as against the policies of the political party on their campaign trail. And I think that in itself says something, because you said it's a problem. I like to call things a challenge. It's a challenge because oftentimes we have lived in a society for so long where we believe everything we must go to the politician for. So we get caught up in the politics, the personalities of politics, instead of appreciating and understanding perhaps what is it does a party stand for. Leading up to our independence, for example, there was a clear distinction between the two traditional political parties. It was clear that the People's United Party was a social justice party. It spoke of issues of land reform, education reform, etc., and so on and so forth. And the United Democratic Party was more party of what you call free enterprise. They were more, and leading up to it, they were tied a lot into American liberalism and free enterprise politics and so on and so forth. Today, it is very difficult to distinguish what these parties truly stand for. And that is where part of the disillusionment, because people have expectations. And as you have said, so the expectation is there that things are going to change. But it doesn't change, and we continue to see this. One of the ways in which one can start combating that and is for, even within the political parties, for them to start demanding accountability of their leaders, because sometimes that is where it starts. Demanding accountability in terms of what are the policies, what are the programs that we want to bring about, what is the change we want to bring about when we go to government. And it is not just saying I am going to do A without talking about the prescription. I think one of the challenges, and going back to the Political Reform Commission, I spoke earlier of the difference between political reform and constitutional reform, and I also want to say something here to interject. This is a general conversation.
Yes.
This really needs a series, and I would hope maybe Channel 5 do a series and bring in some key people to discuss varying aspects of this. But we say constitutional reform is a component of political reform. Another challenge of the political reform process, for example, is that political reform is a continuous process. And I started by saying that it's not a one activity, it's not a one event. So when this process done, that was it. I think what I have produced, and I have not seen anything else, what I have produced in terms of an accounting of what has been implemented, what has not been implemented, what has been partially is perhaps the first such accounting. You ought to have had, subsequent to the submission of that report, an accounting or every 3 years, every 5 years. That then goes back to say that there was no action plan. So there was no plan to look at this 133 recommendations and to say, okay, these are the actions that must take place. Some were clear that they required constitutional changes. And so if you noted in the report I did, you'll see beside them number so and so of 2005, because these are the bills that went in for the constitutional changes. But when you speak, for example, of the structured education, or you know, and those other things, you don't see.
I think a great example is one that we have on screen right now when you look at decreasing the divisiveness of partisan politics in society. Without an action plan, that is...
yeah, exactly. But not only the action plan, the indicators. How do we know that this has been achieved?
And how does one set out to achieve it? While something like the educational campaign would assist in that process. I wanted to go back to what you were speaking about the legislative review. One of the things, and even in some of the recommendations that have been implemented, is that the laws are put in place, but almost with a potential out clause. Or with not enough definition to be able to allow for the type of transparency that it was hoped to have achieved. Let's look at this broad process of in consultation with. We hear it all the time, that appointments are made based on the Prime Minister's recommendation in consultation with the Leader of the Opposition. Now, we've had representatives, and this does tie in, from the UNCAC project board, and they visited Jamaica, and they spoke of being very impressed with the process of having both the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister jointly agree.
That's right.
Not in consultation.
That's
In other words, the recommendation has to be a person that the Leader of the Opposition feels will be impartial, and that the Prime Minister feels will be impartial. So a person of integrity is allowed to be in that post. Let's discuss. That's just one example. How even the reform the recommended legislations in the reform still allowed for some areas of gray.
Exactly. And I think this is where it boils down to clearly what were some of the definitions. I was a member of the commission, and I recall having a conversation with the members and saying, you know, one of the key things that perhaps is needed even prior to getting involved in this process and having a consultation is for an actual education on the Constitution itself, to see where are these weaknesses and deficiencies that would that is not bringing about, or which is causing these pitfalls. Because if we can then look at that, and as we have agreed that the Constitution is the start, from the Constitution then you have the varying other pieces of legislation that supports the implementation, at least the, in theory, to support the Constitution. That was not seen as a key thing or an important thing. And I remember saying, how many households do we have in Belize? Why don't we print, I think at the time, and I remember why I said, well, we print 10,000 copies of the Constitution. And let us share them with people so people can read. I would commend SPARE, and I continue to say it, because SPARE at least came up at the time with explaining, understanding. But SPARE is an NGO challenged by financial resources. You made the classic point of said there are certain things that the state must lead in partnership with civil society. Education and knowledge building about our Constitution, how we are governed, what are these pitfalls, what it is that we need to do. If we didn't start from that, then it stands to reason that everything else is flawed. Because going back to the point of consultation, using that, if we are saying that for judges of the Supreme Court, and we can use them as an example, the Auditor General, key
Integrity
Commission, key institutions that is supposed to provide the checks and balance within our so-called democracy and governance system. If these things are supposed to be in place, then it must be that at a minimum we have consensus of those political parties on these appointments. But if it's a case of I will tell you who I will appoint and you can, and the consultation is simply to inform you, then immediately sometimes people catch feelings too, you know? But the reality is that it ought not to be that. It ought not to be about feelings or being in opposition or being in government.
And this goes back to one of the issues that you mentioned earlier, that our political system has become so personality driven. And I keep on telling people, when things like this are said, it is not necessarily an attack on the person who's making the appointment. It is saying that you may trust this person now to be able to do it, but if it is maintained as the status quo, someone else may come in and use that power not to what would be in the benefit of whatever post that they're recommending for. So when we entrust all this power and authority to individuals and to positions, we're not necessarily allowing for the type of accountability we want.
Exactly. And I want to also use perhaps another example, going back to the point you raised as to where we are on certain things. We have discussed, and I know I've sat on this couch already and discussed the whole issue of the role of what we speak of democracy. What do we mean by democracy? I think that is very key, because an understanding of what democracy means also starts saying to people, well, are we actually practicing democracy? So we need to have that understanding. Issues of separation of powers, checks and balance, absolute power corrupts, that has been something that we come from the Greek philosophers. But where we have, for example, and we have seen this, a cabinet government, so to speak, that the cabinet goes into the legislature and the legislature simply rubber stamps something that comes out of the cabinet. Then we recognize that there's no separation between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. How many of our Belizean people appreciate or understand that there's a reason for the separation? The legislature make laws, the executive execute, implement laws, and the judiciary interpret laws. So they are clearly different functions. Now, when we have a situation, and 3 of the 14 pitfalls that this Political Reform Commission was supposed to address had to do with the separation of powers. It spoke of the centralization, for example, of powers within the cabinet. It spoke of the House being a rubber stamp, and the ineffectiveness of the separation of the powers. But if we don't grasp that, then that by itself starts the whole concept of addressing corruption. Because the legislature is supposed to be the oversight body of what the executive is doing. But if the legislature is so construed in such a way that anything that the cabinet or the executive says goes and is agreed upon, then there is no separation, there is no oversight. So I think these things are very important for us to appreciate.
Let's go back a bit. I recall as young student at the primary school level in a social studies class, we were taught what the role of the judiciary, the legislation, and the executive are, the individual roles. We were also taught that these are independent and autonomous of each other, which you speak to as a separation of powers. For one to be able to understand the corruption that we believe is so very innate in the very systems that govern us, I think that one has to go back and have an understanding of what those three key elements are. And I don't know that that may be the case today, where people tend to think that anything that seems contrary to what they know as the status quo or what they accept as the standard operating procedures seems to be corrupt. But they don't really understand how these things come together and what the state of play is.
And what is corruption? What constitutes corruption? Because oftentimes is that really corruption? You know, what constitutes corruption? And I think I'm going back to what you said. That was one of the recommendations, if you'll remember, is that same structured, and this is why the word was used, structured education. And I call it knowledge building, because the more we provide knowledge to our people, I am the fundamental belief that the more people are provided with knowledge, the more informed they become. And it depends on the kind of knowledge at different levels. For example, when you're in the primary school, it is key to understand that those very tenets that you just spoke of. But as you move into the high and tertiary, you start appreciating a little bit more why is it that certain things don't work. So our syllabus then is structured to more analyze why is it that we still have corruption? Why is it that we don't have transparency? Why is it that there's this incestuous relationship between the executive and the legislative and so on and so forth? It hasn't reached there.
You know, that brings me to one of the critical points, and that's, we focused a lot on it in this conversation, and it is looking at what we want to call just the public's understanding of governance, of government, of what corruption is. And I appreciate what Isani said in terms of what we learn in civics class or social studies or whatever they call it at that point. But if I'm to use my personal example, my knowledge and understanding of governance happened as a young adult associated with SPARE. And not so much from what I learned from my it was civics then, civics class. And so I feel that somehow the level of education or awareness that is being promoted from children right into adulthood is perhaps not sufficient. Perhaps that's why we are in this particular position where we're not demanding more political reform, where we're not demanding proper implementation of some of the laws and policies that we do have.
Definitely.
But the question remains, whose responsibility is it?
I like to say it's everybody's responsibility. And going back to what Isani said, the school structure is such that there is a narrative that comes out of government as it relates to the school structures. If we can just use the Belize, Guatemala referendum and the unsubstantiated claim of Guatemala to Belize, the government decides on what the narrative is. And so that is the narrative they push. This is why civil society is so very important. I want to commend the current president of the NGO network. I think she's Frida and Senator Osani and them. For the first time, I was able to go on a website and to look at what pieces of legislation were submitted to the House, what was passed, what was not passed, and the contents of these legislation. I have not been able to find that anywhere unless I actually go to Belmopan and go to the House. Now this network, and so it goes back to whose responsibility. It is very important that we recognize that the responsibility is everybody's responsibility. But with every process, Marlene and Isana, you know there will be leaders and there will be followers. And I believe that the NGO community, from what I have seen so far, has been the community that has been challenging the government, respective of what political party has been in government. They have been there. Now, they also have their own mandate. Let us be clear
Yeah.
that they have their own mandate and their own agenda. But if we can do some detangling, if I can put it this way, and give the credit where the credit is due, a lot of the changes and a lot of the reforms that we have seen have been because of the push of civil society. Now, perhaps what the people may want to start demanding is that there actually be some established political reform entity which is led or which is supported by the NGO community, and that resources be provided for it, because political reform is not a one-time process. Political reform is tied in, to go back to, as what I say, expectations of people, what you believe is right and wrong.
Yeah.
So and that changes over time. Our morals, our value systems. I always use the classic, the housing and population census on two key issues. One, how many people are still aligned to a religion, right? 1981, I think we had about 7 or 8 religions. Now we have about 14 or 15. So they're not just 8 or 4 issues, value systems or morality or whatever. They're about 14 or 15. But not only that, we also have, for the first time, we have an increasing amount of people, I think about 12% or so, who is not aligned to any religion. So when our Constitution was done, it was tied into values and morals and principles, supremacy of God, social justice, getting away of economic and social privilege, all of these things. And then you have the Belizean citizen, who another 12 or 14% is no longer calling themselves Garifuna, Creole. They are now Belizean. So there's a lot that is changing and will constantly be changing. So the process always have to be evolving. But if there are no resources provided for the process, and so you're then relying on civil society to push and push the envelope, then that is an issue of resources for them, and they may not always have the resources to deal with something that is very critical.
Well, I think that's a great closing point for the conversation. And of course, this is really just the tip.
Yes.
Barely even the tip of this conversation, but we just wanted to use it to kind of generate some ideas for our viewers, reminding us of this process and what we hope to be able to achieve. So thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Isani. And I want to close by saying that I think the political reform process that was entered into up to 2000 was an excellent process. It had many great achievements. And I think I have not been able to talk about that. It was just a general discussion, but we need to then take stock now and to see what worked, what did not work, what was it intended to achieve, and then to look now as to say what it is that we now want to achieve.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be discussing educational opportunities at UWI, so stay tuned.